Friday's disastrous meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump effectively derailed a deal over Ukraine's rare earth and other minerals that are critical to building today's most advanced technologies. While it's not entirely clear that such a deal would have been in Ukraine's best interest, Donald Trump sought to leverage U.S. military and financial support in exchange for access to Ukraine's natural resources. Now, my plan today was to discuss the details of that deal with you, but that's off the table for now. And while the deal has been described as a shakedown by President Trump, there was some rationale behind it. You see, China dominates the critical minerals sector. In 2024, China accounted for roughly 70% of global production, according to the data that's gathered by Statista. Just last month, China announced it would restrict exports of 5 critical minerals to, quote, safeguard its national security interests, further cementing China's effective monopoly over these crucial minerals. Experts say the move threatens to disrupt industries that rely on these metals, including the defense, renewable energy, and electronics industries. And by the way, electric cars, another field in which China dominates. And according to a report by the U.S. Geological Survey, China's dominance over these critical minerals makes Beijing a persistent threat to the U.S. economy. Now, there's nothing new about economic warfare. It's existed throughout history. But what has changed is how it's waged by the world's superpowers. Today's tools, things like export controls, sanctions, embargoes, they're much more sophisticated and have a much bigger impact. That's because decades of globalization have created a highly interconnected global economy. As a result, actions by superpowers like the U.S. can quickly ricochet around the world. Edward Fishman, a former State Department sanctions official under President Obama, has just published a big fat new book on the subject titled Choke Points: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. It's already being hailed as the authoritative work on the subject matter. It's the story of how America turned the interconnected global economy into a weapon more potent than war. Fishman notes that a key insight from the George W. Bush era, under which economic warfare was revolutionized, was that the U.S. no longer needed China or Russia to support certain foreign policy objectives, such as isolating Iran to prevent it from becoming a nuclear power. The U.S. could bypass these countries altogether and go directly to Wall Street to sever Iran's financial ties. The reason is that the U.S. dollar is the linchpin of the global financial system, making it a critical choke point. Nations, businesses, and banks don't want to lose access to it. Secondary sanctions imposed by the U.S. threatened to do just that, cut off banks from the global financial system if they did business with Iran. And the plan worked. It led directly to the Iran nuclear deal, as Iran's exports to the West and its access to things as basic as international bank transfers, credit cards that could be used outside the country, it ground to an absolute standstill. Experts called it the most successful use of economic warfare in modern history. Fishman writes that doing business in the global economy without the U.S. dollar is like trying to travel the world without a passport. In his new book, Fishman describes how the U.S. came to dominate this new form of economic warfare. Quote, "It is how America fights its most important geopolitical battles today, from thwarting Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons to checking Russian imperialism and China's bid for world mastery. The United States has reached into its economic arsenal to get the job done. In the process, the world economy has become a battlefield. Its commanders are not generals and admirals, but lawyers, diplomats, and economists. Its foot soldiers are not brave men and women who volunteer for military service, but business executives who seek to maximize profits, yet often find they have no option other than to obey Washington's marching orders. And America's strength in these battles stems not from its gargantuan defense budget, but from its primacy in international finance and technology. This is a new kind of war," end quote. When we come back, we'll talk to Edward Fishman about his new book and how Trump is taking economic warfare to dangerous, unseen levels. Joining me now is Edward Fishman, an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University. Fishman served at the State Department during the Obama administration, where he led efforts on economic sanctions in response in Ukraine. Also a member of the team handling sanctions on Iran. He's the author of a groundbreaking new book, Choke Points: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. Edward, good to have you on the show. Thank you.
Ali, thanks for having me on today.
Would have been a great conversation anyway, but given where we are in the world with Ukraine and tariffs and these tariffs that are coming in on Canada and Mexico in a few days, remarkably important conversation. Donald Trump has talked a lot about tariffs being the most beautiful word in the English language. Covered tariffs for a lot of years. They're a thing. They're sometimes really useful and beautiful and sometimes not useful at all and damaging. Why is he so attached to this?
So, look, tariffs historically have been used really for economic reasons. In the very early period of American history, George Washington, you're using tariffs to raise revenue, right? This is what Donald Trump talks about today. Mind you, Ali, at the time, the U.S. government was like 10 guys in an office, right? So it's not viable to do that today. Other times, it's been used to protect industries in the United States from foreign competition. So, for instance, Biden imposed 100% tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles because he wanted to protect the domestic car industry. I think what's different about what Trump is trying to do right now is he's trying to use tariffs as this cure-all, almost a magic bullet to solve every possible problem. Colombia doesn't want to accept migrants on a flight, threaten tariffs. The BRICS want to create a new currency, threaten tariffs. The issue here is that tariffs are actually a weak tool if you're trying to use it as a national security weapon.
They're also, we have more targeted things. So you worked on Iran, for instance, super targeted. We're figuring out a way to not go to war with Iran over its potential nuclear efforts. America finally took it off the SWIFT system. So you send a wire anywhere, you have a SWIFT number. There's no SWIFT numbers in Iran. They literally had to stop doing business with the world almost overnight, except with rogue regimes that would do it without any war.
That's exactly right. And I think that's why the Iran sanctions have been so impactful, right? It wasn't tariffs on Iran. It wasn't a trade embargo on Iran. Those are things that the U.S. had for a very long time. A big story that I tell in Choke Points is how really in the mid-2000s, right around 2006, the U.S. government figured out how to weaponize the dollar-based financial system to isolate Iran from the global economy. And the real innovation that actually an individual, probably the most interesting character in my book, Stuart Levy, comes up with is that he doesn't actually have to go persuade the Chinese government or the Indian government to go along with the sanctions. He can go talk directly to the CEOs of banks in places like London or Frankfurt, take evidence with him showing how their banks are being used to funnel money into Iran's nuclear program or to support Hamas and Hezbollah, and basically just persuade those banks to stop doing business with Iran of their own volition. And then the stragglers, you can threaten them and say, look, if you continue doing business with Iran, we will cut you off from the dollar-based financial system. And as a result, you isolated Iran from the global economy. You got an Iranian government who wanted to negotiate away their nuclear program, and you got a deal to do this peacefully.
Yeah, and then we walked away from the deal. Let's talk about other currencies. You mentioned BRICS. China has talked about this for a while, creating an alternative currency, which would undermine the argument here, right? That the world needs dollars. The world all wants to have dollars. Is there a viable alternative? Could the Chinese come up with something, or could somebody else come up with something?
So look, the choke points that I discuss in my book, like the dollar, which are these really critical parts of the global economy where one country dominates, they come and go. They're not immutable, right? So at some point, there will be something that is a successor to the dollars we use today. That doesn't necessarily mean that China will be controlling it. I think one of the problems we have right now, Ali, is that we've been kind of standing still, right? We've been relying on the same dollar-based architecture from the 70s. You mentioned SWIFT. SWIFT was created in 1973, right? What China's been doing recently is they've launched a digital central bank currency, the digital RMB. They've created a platform called mBridge that allows countries to trade with their own central bank digital currencies. They're basically innovating in this area while the U.S. has been standing still. So the thing I'm worried about, Ali, isn't so much that tomorrow we'll wake up and the RMB will be the world's reserve currency. It's that there'll be a technological disruption in which we're actually able to send money across borders much more quickly, and the U.S. will be kind of playing catch-up.
Why did what worked so well for America with Iran why has it not worked for Russia as it relates to Ukraine?
So I think the Russia sanctions are a tragic story, Ali, because if you go back to when I was involved in the Russia sanctions, I was part of the team that designed the original sanctions after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. In the winter of 2014 to 2015, Russia's economy was falling off a cliff. It was actually declining at an annualized rate of 10% in that winter. And what happened, right? Instead of pressing our advantage and really trying to get a good deal, the European leaders were petrified. They were worried that contagion would spread into their own economies. And so you had Angela Merkel basically rush into a deal with Putin in February of 2015 that was not worth the paper it was written on. The deal was violated multiple times. We never increased sanctions. And then Trump gets elected in 2016, and he does absolutely nothing on Russia sanctions for 4 whole years. So I think by the time Biden is dealing with this problem in the fall of 2021, you have 100,000 Russian troops on the Ukrainian border. Putin has decided that the West just doesn't have the stomach to hit him with devastating economic consequences. And so as a result, when world leaders like Biden are going up there and saying, if you invade Ukraine, you will be hit with the most devastating sanctions ever imposed, Putin says, I've seen this before, and it's not so bad.
How does this minerals deal fit into your thesis here, the minerals deal that didn't happen? Because China does control most of the important minerals that the U.S. says it needs to for industry.
That's exactly right. And look, we are living in an age of economic warfare. Sanctions, tariffs, export controls, that's how countries compete today. It's how the U.S. competes with things like the dollar, with advanced computer chip technology, but it's also how China increasingly wages war. And the key choke point that China controls are these critical minerals, because things like graphite and lithium, you need them to build batteries. And we cannot build electric cars in the United States without these minerals and without batteries made in China. And so just as the way the U.S. weaponizes the dollar, China weaponizes these minerals. This deal with Ukraine, I think that tragically blew up, I think because potentially J.D. Vance was trying to make a point or something, I'm not totally sure, would have helped insulate the American people from Chinese economic warfare. It would have made you and me safer from Xi Jinping hurting our economy. And I just think it's a pity that that has now, gone to waste.
What an amazing conversation. There are probably 50 more that come out of this book. What a great book. Thank you for being with us. We'd love to continue the conversation with you.
Thanks, Ali.
Edward Fishman is an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University, author of the important book, Choke Points, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare.